The night had fallen heavy over Stockholm, the kind of silence that feels almost staged, as if the city were holding its breath. Lisbeth Salander sat in front of her computer, eyes sharp and unblinking as lines of encrypted files began to open, one by one. What started as a simple routine dive into the archives of a powerful industrialist had turned into something far more sinister. Behind the layers of financial reports, legal documents, and personal correspondences, she stumbled across fragments of information that didn't belong there. Memos cut short, letters signed with trembling hands, and an old photograph of a young woman who looked terrified, her face frozen in a haunting expression. It was out of place, but Lisbeth knew better than anyone that accidents didn't exist in the digital shadows where powerful men kept their darkest secrets. Her fingers tapped the keyboard in rapid bursts, unearthing more data. Soon, the picture became clearer. A family secret had been buried deep, something that whispered of violence, silenced voices, and an entire legacy built on corruption. Lisbeth leaned back in her chair, her black hair falling into her eyes, the glow of the monitor, washing her face pale. She had always been drawn to chaos, to uncovering what others desperately wanted hidden. But this was different. It wasn't just about corruption or money. It was about blood, history, and wounds that had never healed. Somewhere out there, people had suffered, and their cries had been smothered beneath the weight of family name and power. She scrolled through a scanned diary entry, the words jagged as if the writer's hand had trembled with every letter. They know what happened. They will never let it come out. Lisbeth felt the unease crawl across her skin. She knew the tone of someone who had been trapped, someone who had witnessed horrors but had no escape. In her mind, she began piecing together a story of violence stretching back decades, a pattern that the outside world had overlooked, or perhaps willfully ignored. It wasn't just coincidence. Families with money and reputation often had the dirtiest hands, and Lisbeth had just scraped the surface of something that smelled rotten. The industrialist whose files she was combing through had a spotless reputation, on paper. He was celebrated for his contributions to business, praised for his philanthropy, his name etched onto plaques in museums and libraries. But Lisbeth knew better than to believe in the public face of the rich. Every perfect image was a mask, and every mask hid fractures. As the documents unfolded, she realized this wasn't simply about business corruption. There was a thread of personal darkness woven into the fabric of the family. A daughter who vanished without explanation, whispers of domestic abuse that had been hushed, and an inheritance trail that made little sense. Every breadcrumb Lisbeth followed only widened the pit in her stomach. She lit a cigarette, her hand steady, though her mind buzzed with the electricity of discovery. Memories of her own past surfaced uninvited. Memories of being silenced, ignored, brutalized, and branded a liar by those who were supposed to protect her. The parallels between her scars and the hidden scars of this family ignited something in her chest. A bitter fire that was part empathy, part fury. She wasn't just uncovering someone else's nightmare. She was staring into a mirror that reflected her own battles with power and cruelty. For Lisbeth, secrets like these weren't just academic. They demanded to be dragged into the light. She opened another folder, this one tucked deep inside a chain of encrypted archives. The contents were worse than she expected. Transcripts of police reports that had never been filed, grainy photographs of bruised faces, and a ledger that hinted at hush money paid to silence witnesses. The realization struck her. This wasn't just a family secret. It was a conspiracy built over generations. The kind of conspiracy that could make people disappear without a trace. Lisbeth's pulse quickened, but her expression remained cold, unreadable. To most, this discovery would have been terrifying, a reason to back away. But to Lisbeth, it was a challenge. She thrived in these shadows, her mind sharpened by years of surviving men who thought themselves untouchable. The girl in the photograph haunted her. Who was she? Why had her face been hidden in a file designed to be forgotten? Lisbeth felt the need to know, to give shape to the silence that hung around the girl's terrified eyes. She typed faster, connecting dots that had been scattered, deliberately, weaving them together into a tapestry of pain. Each new clue pulled her deeper into a labyrinth of lies where the walls were built out of fear, shame, and cruelty. The deeper she went, the clearer it became that this wasn't only about one girl. It was about a pattern of violence, protected by wealth and status, covered up again and again. Her apartment was dark, except for the flickering screen, but Lisbeth's focus never wavered. She had seen enough to know this was bigger than she had anticipated. Somewhere inside this web was the truth, and she was determined to rip it out thread by thread. The industrialist and his family thought their secrets would remain buried forever, sealed away behind locked accounts and silenced victims. But Lisbeth Salander wasn't the kind of person who let the powerful sleep soundly on their sins. She had found the crack in their armor, and once she had her foot wedged in, there was no going back. The disappearance of Henrik Vanger's beloved niece, Harriet, had become one of those unsolved mysteries that hung over Sweden like a persistent shadow. To the public, it was a decades-old tragedy, the kind of story newspapers printed in anniversary, columns with faded photos and speculative theories. But to Henrik, it was an open wound that never stopped bleeding. He had searched tirelessly for answers, chasing leads that fizzled into nothing, clinging to the hope that somewhere, someone still knew what happened that day. Lisbeth first came across the case buried in a cluster of old files connected to the Vonner family empire, documents Henrik had quietly commissioned to keep the investigation alive long after everyone else gave up. The more she read, the more the disappearance twisted into something darker than a simple missing person case. Harriet hadn't just vanished into thin air, she had been erased, her existence swallowed by silence. The day she disappeared, the entire Vanger family had been gathered on their private island estate, supposedly celebrating a holiday. Roads had been closed due to an accident on the bridge, cutting off the island completely. No one could have come or gone, which meant Harriet's disappearance was not only impossible, it was monstrous. She had been trapped on that island with her family, and yet she was nowhere to be found when night fell. The official reports painted it as a mystery with no solution, but Lisbeth knew how to read between lines. In the testimonies, family members contradicted themselves, memories shifted like smoke, and timelines were suspiciously blurred. Someone was lying. Someone knew. And the deeper Lisbeth studied the Vanger family tree, the more twisted the branches became. Business rivalries, inheritance disputes, whispered allegations of abuse. It was less a family and more a nest of vipers, coiled tightly together, hissing in the shadows. Harriet had been young, fragile, but also intelligent enough to notice things children weren't supposed to see. That alone could have been her undoing. Lisbeth closed her eyes for a moment, letting her mind reconstruct the day of the disappearance. She imagined Harriet's face, the last known photos of her smiling timidly, her blonde hair falling into her eyes, her shoulders hunched as if she already carried the weight of secrets. What did she see that day? What truth was so dangerous that it required her to vanish completely? The case was decades old, But the fear Lisbeth felt reading those files was fresh, immediate, alive. It wasn't just the mystery of a lost girl. It was the suffocating realization that an entire family had buried the truth together, sealing Harriet's fate in silence. Each document Lisbeth uncovered pulled her deeper into Henrik's obsession. She read his private notes, scrawled in handwriting that shook with age but burned with desperation. He had never stopped believing Harriet was murdered, that someone in his family knew exactly what happened and had lived comfortably with the knowledge for years. That kind of betrayal was unimaginable to most, but to Lisbeth it made perfect sense. Families had a talent for protecting their monsters. She herself had been a victim of such protection. Those who hurt her had been shielded, while she had been branded the problem, the liar, the misfit. Harriet's story, even in its silence, spoke to her in ways no words could. The disappearance wasn't a cold case to Lisbeth. It was an open challenge, a puzzle designed to be unsolvable, a knot tied so tightly that time itself was supposed to wear it away. But as Lisbeth stared at the scanned photographs, maps of the island, transcripts of interrogations, she felt the familiar pull of obsession. The more impossible the case appeared, the more determined she became. There was something here. Something everyone else had missed, or perhaps chosen not to see. She was not afraid to look where others turned away. She zoomed in on one of the family photos taken during the holiday gathering. Everyone was smiling stiffly, their bodies arranged like pieces on a chessboard. But Lisbeth didn't see the smiles. She saw the tension in their shoulders, the distance in their eyes, the barely hidden disdain between cousins and siblings. Families like this didn't love. They tolerated. They schemed. They endured. And Harriet, standing slightly apart from the rest, seemed almost out of place, as if she didn't belong to them at all. That isolation might have been her greatest danger. The case whispered of cruelty disguised as tradition, of violence woven into the walls of the Vanger estate. The deeper Lisbeth went, the more certain she became that Harriet's disappearance wasn't random. It was deliberate. It was controlled. It was the work of someone who knew the island, knew the family, and knew how to erase a life without leaving a trace. Mikael Blomqvist's reputation had been battered by the trial that nearly ruined him. His name dragged across headlines, his career at Millennium magazine hanging by a thread. He had always chased the truth with a doggedness that made enemies, in the corridors of power, but now he stood on unsteady ground, discredited and marked as reckless. Henrik Vanger saw something in that vulnerability. A man who had nothing left to lose, who might be desperate enough to take on a case everyone else had abandoned. When the old industrialist summoned him to the island, Mikael was skeptical. A missing girl from 40 years ago sounded less like journalism and more like chasing a ghost. But Henrik's conviction, his trembling voice when he spoke of Harriet, carried a weight that cut through Mikael's cynicism. It was never meant to be simple. Henrik offered resources, archives, and complete access to his family's history on the condition that Mikael dedicate himself fully to the investigation. In return, Henrik hinted at information that could help restore Mikael's credibility, a bargain the disgraced journalist could not easily dismiss. He arrived at the Vanger estate with his notebooks and recorder, stepping into an atmosphere so heavy with secrets it felt suffocating. The family greeted him with icy politeness, their smiles as sharp as knives, their eyes filled with distrust. To them, he was an outsider prying into matters long buried. To Mikael, they were suspects, wearing expensive suits, It didn't take long for Mikhail to realize he was out of his depth. The labyrinth of the Vanger family history was thicker, darker, and more dangerous than he had anticipated. Each name came with its own set of scandals, grudges, and whispers of violence. He filled pages with timelines, cross-referencing alibis, and movements, yet the pieces refused to fit. It was like trying to solve a puzzle with half the pieces missing. He knew he needed help. Someone who could see what he couldn't. Someone who lived in shadows and understood them. That someone was Lisbeth Salander. At first, Mikhail didn't trust her, and the feeling was mutual. Lisbeth was unpredictable, her silence cutting sharper than words, her gaze dissecting him as if she could read every lie he had ever told. She didn't care about professional reputations or journalistic ethics. She cared about facts, about the raw edges of truth that others tried to smooth over. Henrik's lawyers had introduced her into the investigation quietly, almost reluctantly, after Lisbeth's hacking skills proved indispensable in gathering background information on Mikhail himself. That was how she operated, unnoticed until she was unavoidable. Their first meeting was awkward, tense. Mikhail expected a partner. Lisbeth gave him nothing but clipped sentences and a warning glare that said she didn't have time for his questions. Yet, when she opened her laptop and began tracing the digital shadows of the Vanger family, Mikhail understood why she was there. She saw patterns he had overlooked, threads of connections hidden behind years of obfuscation. Where he built theories, she shredded them and rebuilt them sharper. Where he asked questions, she found answers buried in places no one dared look. Working together was less a partnership and more a collision. Mikhail brought persistence, charm, and the ability to coax words from reluctant mouths. Lisbeth brought fire, precision, and an almost ruthless refusal to accept anything but the unfiltered truth. They argued, mistrusted, pushed back against each other's methods. But beneath the friction was a fragile respect. Mikhail realized that Lisbeth's jagged edges weren't flaws. They were armor, forged by a past that had taught her survival came before everything else. And Lisbeth, though she would never admit it aloud, found something in Mikhail's relentless pursuit of Harriet's story that mirrored her own drive, an unwillingness to let silence win. As days passed on the island, their work began to overlap, each revelation feeding into the other. Mikhail would uncover inconsistencies in interviews with family members, and Lisbeth would dive into financial records and digital traces that exposed hidden motives. Slowly, painfully, the fog around Harriet's disappearance began to thin. Yet, with every answer came a new danger. A sense that the deeper they dug, the closer they came to provoking something, or someone, who wanted the truth to stay buried. The investigation began to stretch far beyond the neat boundaries of a missing person's case. What Mikhail and Lisbeth uncovered was not simply the story of Harriet's disappearance, but a rotten core that had festered within the Vanger family for generations. Old police files hinted at patterns of violence, women who had gone missing, in towns connected to Vanger business holdings, brutal assaults that had never been solved, whispers of atrocities covered up by influence and wealth. Henrik had suspected something like this all along, but even he hadn't grasped the full extent of the darkness his family name concealed. Lisbeth pored over decades of financial ledgers and travel records, her sharp eyes catching anomalies where others had only seen numbers. Payments disguised as donations, sudden withdrawals timed suspiciously close to unsolved crimes, company cars logged in towns where women had vanished. These weren't coincidences. They were breadcrumbs, left behind by someone who had believed himself too powerful to be caught. Mikael, in turn, combed through archives of old newspapers, clipping articles about disappearances, murders, and unsolved assaults. Alone, each story had been a tragedy consigned to memory. Together, they formed a grotesque mosaic that pointed back to the Vangers. The deeper they went, the more disturbing the details became. Old photographs revealed women who looked eerily similar. Young, vulnerable, often outsiders who had slipped into the margins of Swedish society. Marginalized voices no one missed. Their faces haunted Mikael at night, while Lisbeth's fury simmered into something sharp and personal. She knew what it was like to be voiceless, to be dismissed, to have your pain ignored because it was inconvenient. Every file she opened felt like a mirror to her own scars, and it fueled her determination. This wasn't just about Harriet anymore. This was about all of them. Family gatherings, business records, and travel itineraries overlapped in ways that were too precise to ignore. Mikael and Lisbeth began piecing together a chilling theory. Harriet's disappearance wasn't an isolated event, but part of a legacy of violence spanning decades, buried beneath the glittering reputation of the Vanger Empire. The island estate, once a symbol of wealth and tradition, now loomed like a fortress hiding unspeakable crimes. Behind its manicured gardens and stately halls, Lisbeth could almost hear the echoes of screams that had been silenced long ago. Every lead they uncovered made the walls close in tighter. Someone in the family had orchestrated these crimes, or at the very least protected the one who did. The idea that blood ties had bound them into silence made Mikael's stomach turn. He thought of Henrik, the old man's haunted eyes, and wondered if even he had been blind to the scale of the evil in his own lineage. The Vangers weren't just a wealthy family with secrets. They were predators who had learned how to thrive in plain sight, shielded by their influence and power. And still, there were gaps. Documents missing, names erased, trails cut off deliberately. It was as if someone had walked through the family history with scissors, cutting out just enough to keep the truth obscured. Lisbeth, however, thrived in those absences. She knew that missing pieces often spoke louder than the ones left behind. She tore through encrypted archives, traced erased data fragments, rebuilt the shadows that others had tried to destroy. Each time she unearthed a scrap of truth, the story grew more horrifying until the weight of it pressed down on both of them. Mikael realized they weren't just investigating a crime. They were trespassing into a world that had been carefully protected for generations. The further they dug, the more he felt eyes on him, as if the walls of the Vanger estate themselves were watching, waiting, daring him to continue. And Lisbeth, though outwardly composed, could feel the same tension. Somewhere within that family, a predator was still alive, still breathing, still watching them peel back the layers of a history written in blood. Lisbeth had always been able to separate herself from the cases she worked on, keeping a cold detachment that made her effective where others faltered. But as the investigation into Harriet's disappearance dragged her deeper into the Vanger family's darkness, the walls she had built around her past began to crack. Each document, each testimony, each hint of violence inflicted on women who had no power to fight back, triggered something inside her. It wasn't just research anymore. It was memory. And memory was something Lisbeth had spent her life trying to outrun. Late at night, when the estate fell silent, and even Mikael had retreated to his room, Lisbeth would sit alone with her laptop, the glow of the screen painting her in ghostly light. She scrolled through photographs of victims, staring at bruises, hollow eyes, torn clothing. The images bled into her own scars, invisible, yet carved deep into her. She remembered the times she had screamed, and no one listened. The times she had been locked away, dismissed as unstable, branded as a problem instead of a victim. The Venger family's legacy of cruelty wasn't abstract to her. It was personal, a reflection of the system that had failed her again and again. As Mikhail mapped out alibis and timelines, Lisbeth found herself mapping memories she never spoke of. The man who had hurt her when she was a child, the guardian who had treated her body as a cage, the judges and social workers who had looked the other way. They had all been part of the same machine that allowed predators to walk free while women like her carried the weight of silence. Every new clue about Harriet felt like reopening an old wound, but instead of weakening her, it sharpened her resolve. If Harriet had been silenced, if her life had been swallowed by the Venger machine, then Lisbeth would not allow her to be forgotten. Her nightmares became more frequent. She woke in the dark, drenched in sweat, heart pounding as phantom hands grabbed her wrists as voices whispered that no one would ever believe her. But when the terror subsided, what remained was fury, a cold, controlled fury that she funneled back into the case. Lisbeth wasn't afraid of monsters. She had lived with them, survived them, and in some ways, become one herself. That was what gave her an edge. The Vengers thought they had built a fortress impenetrable to the outside world, but Lisbeth knew exactly how to dismantle fortresses. She had been tearing down walls her entire life. Mikhail noticed the change in her, though he didn't dare ask. He saw the way her hands trembled slightly when she came across reports of sexual violence, the way her jaw tightened when she read transcripts of women who had been dismissed by police. He wanted to reach out, to say something human, but Lisbeth's armor warned him off. She didn't need comfort. She needed focus. She wielded her pain like a blade, sharp and unrelenting, and Mikhail quickly learned that her scars made her the most dangerous ally he could have. The past she carried wasn't just bleeding into the case, it was fueling it. For Lisbeth, this was no longer about solving a puzzle for Henrik Venger, or even restoring Mikhail's reputation. It was about justice, about revenge, about ensuring that the screams buried in those files were finally heard. Every page she turned, every secret she unlocked, was a battle against the silence that had nearly destroyed her once. And though she never said it aloud, she knew the truth. Finding Harriet's fate was the same as finding her own voice again, proving that no matter how powerful the predators were, they could not erase the victims forever. The deeper Mikhail and Lisbeth pushed into the tangled roots of the Venger family, the more the facade of unity crumbled. What had once seemed like a wealthy, tightly bound dynasty began to reveal itself as a web of betrayals, grudges, and whispered hatreds spanning decades. The family dinners, the polished smiles in photographs, the carefully staged public appearances, all of it had been a mask, a performance to shield the truth that beneath their wealth and status, they were tearing each other apart. Mikhail sifted through Henrik's private notes and cross-referenced them with his own interviews. Patterns of manipulation and deceit emerged. Cousins who despised each other but played the role of allies in front of Henrik. Siblings who quietly undermined one another for inheritance. Uncles who whispered poison into the ears of their children to keep old resentments alive. The more Mikhail mapped the connections, the clearer it became that loyalty in the Venger family was not love. It was survival, and it was often bought with silence. Lisbeth was less interested in their staged civility, and more focused on the cracks that bled through when they thought no one was watching. Her hacking exposed emails laced with venom, bank transfers designed to edge one family member out of power, and carefully hidden records of lawsuits settled out of court. Betrayals weren't accidents. They were currency. In this family, blood was a leash, not a bond, and betrayal was the language they spoke fluently. One night, while examining a series of letters between Harriet and her cousin Cecilia, Lisbeth uncovered a painful truth. Harriet had confided in Cecilia about someone in the family who frightened her. The letters were fragmented, cautious, as if Harriet feared even writing the words down. "He watches me. He knows I see things I shouldn't. If anything happens, remember that I told you." Cecilia, when Mikhail questioned her, feigned ignorance, insisting she had no memory of such fears. But Lisbeth knew she was lying. Her financial records showed she had received regular, discreet payments from Henrik in the years after Harriet's disappearance. Was it guilt money or hush money? The answer lay somewhere in the silence Cecilia refused to break. The betrayals weren't only horizontal, among siblings and cousins. They stretched upward and downward through the family tree. Henrik himself had been betrayed by those closest to him, his trust eroded by their refusal to speak the truth about Harriet. He had loved his family, built an empire to sustain them, but the loyalty he had expected was an illusion. They had chosen self-preservation over honesty, protecting the family's name while letting Harriet vanish into myth. Lisbeth saw it clearly. The Vangers weren't just keeping secrets, they were complicit. Even those who hadn't committed crimes had turned their eyes away, had chosen silence over truth, had let betrayal fester because it was easier than exposing the rot. Families like this didn't just breed violence, they protected it, nurtured it, passed it down like an inheritance. And Harriet, young and alone, had been swallowed by it. Mikhail began to feel the suffocating weight of their lies pressing in on him. Each interview left him with the sense that he was circling predators who smiled politely while hiding their teeth. Every member of the Vanger family seemed capable of betrayal, of keeping Harriet's fate locked away. And Mikhail realized that untangling truth from deceit in this house was like asking a snake to shed its skin and reveal something human underneath. For Lisbeth, betrayal wasn't surprising. It was expected. Families always betrayed. The only question was how far they were willing to go to protect themselves. In the Vangers' case, the answer seemed limitless. Every new discovery Mikhail and Lisbeth unearthed carried with it the bitter taste of rot, as though each clue was less an answer and more a descent into a deeper layer of darkness. What began as a search for Harriet's fate had transformed into an excavation of secrets so foul that even Henrik, with all his suspicions, hadn't grasped their full extent. The Vanger family wasn't just fractured by grudges, it was steeped in depravity. And the closer Mikhail and Lisbeth came to the truth, the more they realized that the most terrifying revelations weren't about strangers, but about the very people sitting across from Henrik at his dinner table. Mikhail spent long hours with stacks of old photographs, police reports, and diaries. Again and again, the same faces appeared near tragedies. Family members whose names were never mentioned in official investigations. Relatives whose alibis never quite held. When cross-referenced with Lisbeth's digital finds, the pieces snapped into place. There wasn't one predator hiding among the Vangers. There were two. A father and son, bound by blood and violence, weaving decades of cruelty into the family's history. The realization shook Mikhail to his core. He had always believed in the pursuit of truth. But nothing prepared him for evidence of such sadism living inside a family cloaked in respectability. He stared at photographs of young women who had gone missing, their smiling faces frozen in time, and felt the sickening weight of how their deaths had been reduced to numbers in police files. To the world, they had been forgotten. To the Vangers, they had been erased deliberately. The evidence whispered of ritual, of pattern, of a cruelty so methodical it felt inhuman. Lisbeth, though outwardly calm, carried a storm inside her as she dug deeper into the files. She traced credit card receipts to motels, dissected grainy surveillance images, and uncovered private journals that had been carefully locked away. The words inside made her stomach churn. Cold confessions of domination, control, and delight. In the act of breaking another human being, it wasn't just violence, it was ideology. A belief passed from father to son, a heritage of cruelty, justified by twisted interpretations of power and entitlement. For Lisbeth, it was more than evidence. It was recognition. She had lived through the hands of men who believed themselves untouchable, who believed their cruelty was their right. Every page she read brought back her own battles. Every victim's face reminded her of the years when she had been voiceless, treated as disposable. But unlike the world that had ignored her pain, she refused to ignore theirs. The ghosts of the women Harriet had seen, the women who had vanished, demanded justice, and Lisbeth intended to give it to them. Mikael began to notice the way the Vangers watched him and Lisbeth during their questioning. Polite words, yes, but eyes that flickered with unease, with calculation. Some of them knew more than they admitted. Perhaps not the full scope, but enough to have lived comfortably in silence. The darkest truths were not hidden in police archives or encrypted files. They sat in living rooms, in inherited wealth, in the faces of men and women who smiled for photographs while standing on foundations built from horror. Every clue they uncovered wasn't just illumination, it was a provocation. They were peeling back layers of lies that had remained undisturbed for decades, and Lisbeth could feel it in the air. Someone was watching them now. Someone aware that the truth was no longer safely buried. The danger was no longer abstract. It was personal. The closer Lisbeth and Mikael crept toward the heart of the mystery, the more the shadows pushed back. It began subtly. Files she had archived vanished from her system overnight. Interviews Mikael had arranged were suddenly canceled. Voices on the other end of the line insisting it was a mistake or a misunderstanding, but Lisbeth knew better. She had lived too long in a world where silence was manufactured, where pressure came in whispers before it came in fists. Someone had noticed how deep they were digging, and someone wanted them to stop. For Lisbeth, danger had never been a deterrent, but this was different. The traps were precise, calculated, designed not just to scare but to eliminate. One night, as she biked through the dim streets back to her apartment, she sensed the hum of an engine behind her. A car crept closer, its headlights off, the road narrowing ahead. Lisbeth didn't panic. Panic was for people who froze. She pushed herself harder, cutting across alleys, her mind running calculations faster than her body. By the time the car screeched past, narrowly missing her, she already knew this was no accident. It was a warning. Mikael wasn't spared either. A brick shattered the window of his cabin on the island, scattering glass across his work. The note left among the shards was simple, written in block letters. "Leave it alone." He brought it to Lisbeth, expecting anger, maybe fear. Instead, she only stared at it with cold detachment before crumpling it in her fist. "They're sloppy," she muttered, as if the threat was less important than the insult to her intelligence. But as the pressure mounted, the danger escalated from intimidation to attempts on their lives. A fire broke out in a storage shed, where Mikkel had been working hours before, the acrid smell of gasoline still clinging to the air. Lisbeth's laptop was hacked by someone skilled enough to almost bypass her defenses, leaving behind fragments of corrupted data that hinted at surveillance closer than she had imagined. For the first time, she wondered if her own armor might not be enough. Still, Lisbeth refused to retreat. The threats only sharpened her focus, her rage growing colder and more precise. If someone wanted her gone, it meant she was close, too close for them to allow her to keep breathing. That knowledge didn't frighten her. It exhilarated her. She had lived her entire life under the fists of men who wanted her silenced. Each attempt only proved she was tearing at the right threads they couldn't afford to have exposed. One night, while following a lead into the woods on the island, Lisbeth felt it, the shift in the air that meant she wasn't alone. Branches cracked softly under deliberate footsteps. Shadows moved where they shouldn't. She knew she was being hunted, cornered in silence. Her hand tightened around the taser she always carried, her pulse steady. Whoever was trying to frighten her didn't understand her at all. She wasn't prey. She never had been. The traps set against them were meant to kill their resolve, to push them off the path toward truth. Instead, they revealed desperation. The closer Lisbeth and Mikkel came, the more dangerous the game became, until it was no longer just about solving Harriet's disappearance. It was survival. And Lisbeth knew survival better than anyone. Justice was supposed to be impartial, clean, a process handled by courts and judges in sterile rooms where words carried the weight of law. But for Lisbeth, justice had never come from the system. It had always failed her, always chosen the powerful over the powerless. As the investigation into Harriet's disappearance reached its most dangerous depths, the line between truth-seeking and vengeance began to blur. What Mikkel still thought of as uncovering facts, Lisbeth began to see as preparation for something far more personal. The files they unearthed, the testimonies pieced together, the photographs and bank records, it all painted a picture of cruelty that begged not just for exposure but for punishment. The predators in the Vanger family had lived too long without consequence, their sins hidden behind money and name. To Lisbeth, dragging their crimes into daylight wasn't enough. The women who had suffered deserved more than reports, more than headlines. They deserved retribution. Her thoughts grew sharper, darker. Late at night, while Mikkel mapped out their findings in tidy timelines, Lisbeth imagined what justice would look like if the courts never touched it. She thought about chains and locked rooms, about the silence of predators forced to finally feel the fear they had inflicted on others. The rage inside her wasn't reckless. It was cold, precise, honed into something like a weapon. Every keystroke, on her laptop, every piece of data she recovered, wasn't just evidence. It was ammunition. Mikkel noticed the shift in her. He saw it in the way her eyes lingered on photographs of the perpetrators, in the tension in her body when their names were spoken. He tried to remind her that exposure was enough, that their job was to bring the truth to Henrik, to let the law do the rest. But Lisbeth only gave him a look, flat and unblinking, that told him he didn't understand. The law had never been on her side. The law had been another weapon used against her. She wouldn't let it decide the fate of monsters. The deeper they pressed, the clearer it became that they weren't just documenting crimes. They were standing at the edge of a confrontation. Lisbeth began to prepare herself as if she were going into battle. She memorized escape routes, carried tools of defense wherever she went, and kept a mental map of the predator's vulnerabilities. To Mikhail, it looked like paranoia. To Lisbeth, it was clarity. She knew violence when she saw it, and she knew it didn't end with polite revelations at family dinners. When she thought of Harriet, she thought of herself, young, terrified, silenced by the weight of people who should have protected her. Harriet had been erased, and Lisbeth refused to let that erasure stand. Justice for Harriet, justice for the other women whose faces haunted the files, demanded more than words. It demanded consequences. If no one else was willing to deliver them, Lisbeth would. The investigation was no longer about solving a puzzle. It was about deciding what kind of ending these crimes deserved, exposure or destruction. And Lisbeth had already made her choice. The storm that had been building through every secret, every lie, and every ghost finally broke when Lisbeth and Mikhail stood with the full weight of the truth in their hands. The Vanger family's carefully constructed facade was torn apart, its legacy revealed not as one of wealth and tradition, but as a dynasty poisoned by brutality and silence. Decades of cruelty, covered and excused, now lay exposed like a raw wound. Yet for Lisbeth, exposure was never enough. The true victory was reclaiming her power in the face of a system that had always tried to strip it from her. When the final pieces of Harriet's fate were uncovered, when the predators within the family were forced into the light, Lisbeth did not feel triumph in the conventional sense. What she felt was a kind of release, a deep exhale after years of rage pressed into her bones. Harriet's story, once smothered in silence, had been given voice again. The women who had been erased were no longer just forgotten names in dusty files. They were recognized, their suffering finally acknowledged. It was not perfect justice, but it was enough to break the cycle of silence. Mikhail, standing beside her, believed in the power of truth to heal, to correct, to punish through exposure. But Lisbeth understood something he didn't. Truth alone does not shatter monsters. Fear does. And for the first time, the predators who had hidden behind power now felt the same fear they had inflicted on others. That, to her, was justice. That was revenge. The corruption at the heart of the Vanger Empire was no longer untouchable. The threads Lisbeth had unraveled could never be rewoven, not after being dragged into the open. The walls of wealth and respectability had cracked, and through those cracks the light had poured in. Lisbeth carried no illusions. She knew there would always be more men like them, more families who concealed violence behind their reputations. But this time, she had torn one of them apart, and she had done it on her terms. For Lisbeth Salander, survival had always been her victory, but in unraveling the Vangers, she found something beyond survival. She found her strength, unbreakable and undeniable. The girl who had once been silenced was now the woman who made the powerful tremble. And though the world would never fully understand her methods or her rage, it no longer mattered. What mattered was that the truth could not be buried again, not while she was still breathing.